The gravity of the time is such that every new avenue of peace, no matter how dimly discernible, should be explored. Never before in history has so much hope for so many people been gathered together in a single organization. You will provide a great share of the wisdom, of the courage, and the faith which can bring to this world lasting peace for all nations and happiness and well-being for all men.
So we are here today with Dr. Chris Keefer, who is an emergency physician and also host of the Decoupled podcast. Chris, welcome to Titans of Nuclear. You've certainly earned a slot based on the work you've been doing lately.
It's an honor to be on your show, Brett. I've been following your work for some time, and your podcast was definitely a motivation for me to get up and going. So thanks for having me on.
Well, I have so much that I'm just like personally curious about, because I, came across your podcast as well. I know this is a lot of just podcasters talking about podcast stuff, but it's probably appropriate. And also, before we get too deep into it, I just want to let the audience know Chris also recorded an episode with another podcast, The Climate Fix, which was just extraordinary. It was an hour and a half. You guys went so deep on so many of the topics that I'm personally interested in. So I recommend everyone pause, find that one, download it, listen to it, and then come back to this one.
Sounds good, Brett. Sounds good.
Chris, let's get started. So like, you are a doctor primarily, right? Like that's your thing.
Yeah, I'm an emergency physician. I have a full-time practice here in Toronto. COVID has made that interesting. But yeah, to some degrees, they call emergency medicine the hobbyist specialty because, we work very intensely when we're at work. They've done sort of workplace studies to see your productivity while you're at work, and we're sort of on task 95% of the time. There's no kind of chit chat around the water cooler. You're just going. You barely make time to pee or eat. But you kind of are able to leave your work at work to a large degree. So it does enable you to, especially if you don't sleep very much, to find the time to engage in some other activities. So
yeah, I was going to push you on that. I was like, how does a doctor have time to do anything else but being a doctor? And you answered that straight away.
There we go.
But can we go a little bit further into your past and history? I'd love to like maybe illuminate some of the things that you have made you into who you are. Like, when did you first develop an interest in medicine, and like, what were some of the pivotal moments? Like, go as early back as you want that really for who you are.
I was primarily actually interested in visual art when I was young. And I liked drawing anatomy. I grew up in the country and, did a bit of like hunting and like snaring rabbits and stuff. And I was always fascinated by the anatomy and drew a lot of pictures and things like that. And didn't have any doctors in the family, but certainly, I don't know, was attracted to that idea of taking on a caring role, having a pragmatic skill that I could put into service of other humans, right? I have a deep interest, in terms of my values in, just trying to improve the conditions of my fellow people out there, right? And
okay, but hold on. Has that always been the way? Because I know some people start feeling that later in life, but what about like when you were a kid or in high school? Were you always like somewhat interested in other?
No, I wasn't like gunning for medicine my whole career. And in fact, I'll be honest, like I sort of did what I was good at, which tended to be the humanities, art, that kind of thing. And didn't see a big role for a science and math and kind of engineering education for myself, because I didn't see a professional situation in which that would be useful. And actually, I did have a moment, I'd sort of gotten interested in medicine in my undergrad, but I said, it's hopeless. Like I stopped math in grade 10. I did some biology because that was kind of the easy science to pursue that you can do without necessarily the strong, math and chemistry and physics background. remember sitting on the bed with my my dad and talking about how I was thinking about, you know, wanting to do medicine, and I was like, but I don't know if I can do it. And he said, you can do it, son. I believe in you. I'm getting a little you know, glassy eyed here, but it was a big moment, and it's a big gamble, right? Medicine is a very, very competitive area to get into. And I only pursued these science studies at the time because I wanted to get into medicine. And so you're making this gamble, right? I mean, my medical school, there's 4,000 applicants for 200 spots, right?
And when we should set the stage. You grew up in Canada?
That's right, yeah.
And where in Canada?
In Ontario,
which
I affectionately call the you know, the France of North America, because we're about 61% nuclear, so we're just behind France in terms of our energy.
And you went to school up there too. You're Canadian through and through.
Yeah, born and bred for sure. Yeah.
Awesome. Okay, so very competitive program somehow, you know, without having learned any math.
And the reason I'm telling that story is not sort of to talk about, you know, it's so competitive, you know, it's so impressive that I got in or anything, but just that it was a gamble. And at that moment in time, I didn't really understand the value of a science education. And boy, has that ever become clear to me, you know, as my life has progressed, just in terms of interpreting the world, right? Understanding the difference between correlation and causation, understanding concepts like relative risk, you know, that have just illuminated so much and allowed me, you know, I'm a very curious person. I'm constantly fascinated in trying to understand the world. And I think about how crippled my education could have been and how limited my faculties could have been if I hadn't taken that diversion. And I was in second year university. I went back to high school and basically crammed chem, physics, calculus over a summer. You know, I was, you know, with a bunch of, you know, 16, 17-year-olds and a few kind of refugees that were upping their education. It was pretty fascinating. But yeah, all that brought me to make an application, and very luckily I got in, and the rest is history.
Yeah, but you got to be pretty motivated. Sorry, I'm going to dwell on your past for a little bit more. But you got to be pretty motivated to do something like that, to go back did you learn motivation anywhere? Like prior to that, like were you a Boy Scout, or were there other formative moments growing up other than like your dad's encouragement, which it sounds like was very influential, where you kind of honed the skills of motivation or self-motivation?
I mean, if I get interested in something, I'm hungry for it, right? And you know, in terms of, you know, a kind of an apprenticeship learning model, I mean, you know, I will, if there's someone who I see has a skill set that I'm interested in, I will devote myself 100% and dive in and learn that and work extraordinarily hard. I mean, prior to my interest in medicine, that hadn't necessarily been an academic focus. You know, delving into my past, I've lived a very, you know, very rich and varied past. I've done a lot of things. And I talk about this a bit on my podcast in terms of like how I've come to be where I am and how unlikely it is, because I very much grew up, you know, with I don't know if a set of politics or coming out of a sort of, I talk about sort of being a kind of a tribe, right? In terms of how we identify, you know, our peer group, our thought leaders, the kind of passive opinions that we form just based upon our identity as, you know, I'm kind of a leftist, or I grew up in a bit of like a hippie community, or in high school, I hung out with this crowd or whatever, right? But, you know, I was actually quite a Luddite. Early on, I was, you know, very concerned again with issues of, you know, distributive justice, of social justice. And for me, I was looking in a very naive way at technology as this tool that just leads to, you know, social stratification, hierarchical power relations, concentration of knowledge and expertise in a way that's kind of anti-democratic. And it's just fascinating because I see that now amongst the people that I'm arguing with. And I can have a deep sort of compassion and deep understanding of where they're coming from, I think, in a way that someone who's maybe more immersed in a different, you know, tribe or education would not. And so, you know, that led me to, you know, really take it to an extreme. I was very fascinated with nature, you know, trying to deeply understand nature. I grew up in the country. There was a huge woodlot where I lived next to, and I probably spent most of my days out there. But it wasn't, you know, it wasn't good enough for me. So I ended up packing up and going to the Yukon Territory, which is kind of right next to Alaska, because I wanted to learn, not so much from like a conservation biologist who goes out into the field 2 months of the year to study, you know, a single, you know, nematode or something. I wanted to understand someone who kind of lived with the land or off the land and understood it. So I went and apprenticed with a trapper, of all things. I lived in a canvas wall tent throughout a minus 50-degree Yukon winter. Like, so I've done some really varied things, and it's equipped me with a way of, I guess, kind of understanding, empathizing, and hopefully being more convincing when I engage with, people who don't share my same opinions on nuclear energy, for instance.
It sounds like it's the variety of experiences that you have that have honed in your skills of empathy building to put yourself in someone else's shoes.
Sure. And I mean, I think like the values that I was born with and that I have maintained throughout are, they continue onwards. Certainly, I guess the means of arriving at the goals that my values are concordant with have changed. I've really kind of reanalyzed things and seen some of the naivete of my earlier thinking. And just done a lot of research, a lot of talking. And we talk about the podcasting thing, but I mean, it's such an incredible vehicle to be able to process things much more deeply. You read someone's book, it's fascinating. You get to call them up, you get to talk about them for an hour, you get to form a personal relationship, and maybe that carries on and you say, hey, I got this other question for you. And it's just so enriching. Yeah.
And I don't know if you've experienced this like I have, but oftentimes I find that I read what someone publishes and I have one impression. And then when I get to ask those like supplemental or auxiliary questions, I actually come away with maybe a different interpretation or understanding of the content.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, just certainly deeper, right? I mean, we talk in our present sort of zeitgeist about, what is it, intensive reading versus extensive reading? Because it's just so easy to scroll through Twitter or, read short articles, but we've really kind of impoverished ourselves intellectually by not deep diving material. Yeah. And so, podcasting, interviewing a guest, I take it very seriously. So I do sort of, probably 16 to 24 hours of prep for each guest.
Wow. Okay. So that's where you and I differ a little bit, because I take the other approach. I take the approach that I don't want to know much about them going in. I want to know their general like subject matter enough to like ask good questions.
Yeah.
But I don't want to know what they're going to say, because I want like the audience to be as surprised as I am and like have that connection with the audience as it's happening a little bit.
I mean, I think I'm just acknowledging that even if I do spend, 24 hours reading their material, I'm still going to be in that position because, I mean, it's just, I've been so blessed with the kind of guests that I've had on, and they're deep people with just huge sources of knowledge.
Yeah, it's amazing. Okay, so people probably don't even really know what we're talking about yet. So we're going to like inch through your career a little bit further.
Sure, yeah.
To become a doctor, I assume that you have to deal with some medical, radiation, nuclear stuff, or you learn about it at some point. But what was the moment that like you started like thinking deeply about nuclear topics?
I mean, it's interesting, like in terms of my attitudes towards nuclear, like I said, this idea of a sort of tribal affiliation, kind of lefty, probably a little more on the crunchy granola spectrum. I remember in Ontario, as I was saying, we're 61% nuclear. We have 3 large nuclear plants. And I remember kind of driving on the highway, from Toronto to Montreal, and you see the signs for Pickering, and there's a nuclear station there. And I used to kind of like speed the car up a little bit or be like, hold my breath, which is just so ironic because this is a totally air pollution free source that like got rid of coal in our province, right? And later on, during my medical studies, I was at McMaster University, and they actually have a nuclear engineering program. And there's a reactor, like a research reactor on campus. And I remember like, you can basically like go up to it and touch the outside containment. And I remember just being like, what is this doing here? Like, isn't this dangerous? Like, should I lead a protest against this? Like I've always had an activist bent, right? And, I was never sort of, I didn't have like a huge sort of Paul on the road to Damascus kind of conversion moment. I was never a committed anti-nuclear activist. I've always, really cared about the environment and conservation, but been motivated more as a humanist around human rights issues, refugee health issues, indigenous issues, things like that. But in terms of, within my medical career, coming into contact with ideas around nuclear and radiation, it's very interesting. If you look at a pie chart of the background radiation that say the average American receives, right? It's, about 2.7 millisieverts. You look at that pie chart and the section of that that's not, radon or cosmic rays, and the section that's artificial is about 15% of the pie chart. Well, 14% of that is medical. Right. So you look at the little sliver that's not medical. There's, tiny like fraction of a percentage that's, the legacy of atmospheric weapons testing. There's an even smaller fraction that's, from nuclear accidents. But fully, 93% of the artificial radiation that you receive as a North American every year is, for me, pulling the trigger on ordering a diagnostic test mostly.
Yeah.
Right. So
and
doctors,
you say pulling the trigger on ordering a diagnostic test. And I'm going to, and like other things that I've heard, it's like there's a certain amount of caution before a doctor commits to applying radiation to a patient. Most people would say, okay, that's a no-brainer, but is it a no-brainer? Are there certain levels of radiation that are more serious than others? Can you walk me through, like, first, like what you know about that, but also like what your training was initially as a doctor and how that might differ?
Yeah, I mean, certainly, the linear no threshold hypothesis, I wouldn't describe it as a scientific consensus, but it is a regulatory consensus, and it permeates medicine as well.
So what is that? What is that? What is linear no threshold?
I mean, so basically this idea that there is, a linear relationship between what we call stochastic effects of radiation. So deterministic is basically you get into these really high doses, like, 2 gray and above, and no matter what, you're going to get acute radiation sickness, which is terrible. Bone marrow suppression, sloughing off of your digestive tract. Very life-threatening stuff, like the Chernobyl first responders got. I think there was
this acute radiation sickness. This isn't like a scrambling of the DNA. This is more like a burn from the inside out.
Yeah. I mean, it's rapidly dividing cells that are deeply impacted. So the most rapidly dividing set of cells you have in your body is basically in your bone marrow, your immune system. And so your immune system becomes completely suppressed, and you're incredibly vulnerable to getting secondary bacterial and fungal and viral infections. And then other rapidly dividing cell structures, as I was saying, in your digestive tract kind of slough off, and you're not able to digest food and get nourishment. So, this was again what impacted. I'm going to blank on the numbers. I think it was about 136 Chernobyl workers and first responders. Of which I believe 28 died. And I mean, they received some really good treatment. Robert Gale, this incredible American physician, who'd done a lot of work with bone marrow transplants, traveled to the Soviet Union at that time. He brought with him one of the first colony stimulating factor medicines, which we use, in cancer patients who we are intentionally suppressing their immune system or giving radiation therapy to stimulate those white blood cells so that their immune system doesn't tank. And he actually injected himself. He did the first kind of human clinical trial, because the Soviets were like, you got this experimental treatment. You're not going to go and, experiment with us. And he said, fine, I'll do it to myself, prove it safe. And then he used it on the ARS patients and ended up saving a lot of lives. So there's such cool stories. I mean,
the history. Yeah. You could fill up history books with all this, but just to kind of hone back in on some of the numbers that you were using, like gray is.
Sure.
So a few gray is like 2 or 3 gray is that's the big dose that we're talking about. That's the one that can slosh up your insides.
Yeah. And then so the linear no threshold, which was your original question, basically, so that there's that sort of what we said deterministic effect. You get 2 grays, you're getting acute radiation syndrome. I forget the lethal dose 50. That's the kind of dose at which 50% of people will die. I think it's around 4 or 5 grays. I don't think anyone survived 7 or 8, like as a whole body dose, right? In cancer treatment, we give, cumulative doses of, I'm not a radiation oncologist, but going off the back of my hand here at like 30 grays or something, right, to a focal piece of tissue, and we fractionate it. So we divide that dose up over, a treatment period of a month, say. So there's a lot of complexity here, but the linear no threshold again says for what we call stochastic effects, which are kind of random effects, notably in relation to radiation cancer, right? The slightly increased risk of cancer that a dose of radiation may or may not give you. We established that relationship in a linear threshold, in a linear model, and we have strong evidence that correlates to doses that get down to around 100 millisieverts. Again, seeing a very tiny increase. But below that, the data is very heterogeneous. So, and it's a very hard thing to study. Once you're getting down to looking at a variable, and then, you're looking at something like radiation and the number of variables that are there that could determine the outcome. And so you have a kind of scatter plot of data points on either side of that idea of that line. which can show sometimes even potentially a beneficial relationship to low dose radiation. I'm quite conservative in that regard. I look at a kind of scatter plot like that and I say, you just can't really draw conclusions from this. But certainly it doesn't look like there is a strong relationship one way or the other. I don't think there is, in my personal opinion, in terms of my review of the literature. And again, like I try and challenge my cognitive biases. So I'll read some papers that, there was an Australian paper that looked at brain cancer incidence in Australian children exposed to CT scans and claimed to have found, a significant increase. There's like the example of that study is there's this thing called reverse causation. So who's getting a CT scan, and we're looking for an effect that's one in several thousand, probably 7,000 or 8,000, right? Well, people getting CT scans, there might be a reason they're getting a CT scan, and that might be because they're getting some symptoms that may eventually be a cancer. Or, the only way to truly do that study is to just take random children off the street, what we call sort of a multi-center, double-blinded, randomized control trial where you'd have to, again, just randomly select kids, put them in either a real CT scanner or a sham CT scanner, scan them, follow them up throughout their lives, try and look at all the other variables. Did they smoke later in their life, this, that, or the other? And the problem is you can't like definitively really establish that relationship one way or the other. And so there's this element of like, well, what if?
Yeah.
And this precautionary principle, which I think has become a really dominant cultural paradigm. And I can go into why I think that is, but yeah. And it's affecting a lot of the potential for human progress.
Yeah. I want to put a pin on the precautionary principle and come back to it. But I want to talk about this concept that we've been discussing, which is like, what is the correct way to model the amount of the relationship between the amount of radiation you receive and the health outcomes of that. And what we've been discussing is that, historically, the model that everyone uses is this linear no threshold model, in which what they say is no matter how low you go, there's still some negative health impact. And what we're discussing is that while they say that, we don't necessarily have the data to back that up. That's more of us just being, the quote unquote better safe than sorry. But in reality, the data is much more complex when you get to these lower.
And the linear no threshold
during like medical treatments and such.
Yeah, and the linear no threshold defies everything we know about the study of toxicology, right?
Yeah.
Where back to Paracelsus, the dose maketh the poison. Right? Everything is poisonous at a high enough dose. I've literally had a patient who, we saved his life, but he almost poisoned himself with water. He drank about 8 liters of water in under an hour. That changed the osmolality of his brain. He absorbed a ton of water into his brain, cerebral edema. His spinal cord was almost crushed by his swelling brain. He needed intensive care, for water, right? And the analogy that I'm using here is, that was 8 liters in an hour. So the linear no threshold, if you applied it to water, would say that, well, if you drink a liter in an hour, then your mortality will be 1/8 of, what it would have been for this guy who, without, incredible medical care, would have died.
Yeah. And can we give the other example? Can we talk about maybe something that you and I, or that the general public might intuitively understand as dangerous, but that we also intuitively know at lower levels has beneficial effects? Can you come up with an example?
Yeah, for sure. So, gravity is a pretty big hazard, right? Are you afraid of heights a little bit?
Yeah, sure, of course.
Right. So, jump off a 100-foot cliff and see what happens. Work on your Stairmaster, jump off a 1-foot step, and you're going to see benefits in bone mineral density and the architecture of your bones. I mean, like, weight-bearing exercises are good for us. And that's the same kind of idea, right? That the linear no threshold says that, okay, one person jumps from a 100-foot cliff, that's 100% fatal, or maybe not. Maybe a few people can survive that with some horrific trauma afterwards. But a 1-foot jump will then be, 1/100th of the danger. And it defies human reasoning. It defies everything that we know about toxicology.
And this is because of the human body is programmed to respond to stress by making itself stronger, low levels of stress. And I guess you were talking about the bone density example. Like, yeah, people know that, like, when you work out more, when you apply stress to parts of your body, yeah, when you tear muscle, by working out, you're applying stress. You may actually be damaging a cell, like permanently destroying a cell, but the in aggregate response of your body to repair ends up leading towards you being in a better condition at the end than when you started. And I think that's another problem. When people look at the radiation, they might say, well, I know how radiation interacts with a single cell, and it does damage definitively. Even the smallest amount of radiation will hurt a cell. I'm looking at a cell right now. They might say that. But what they're doing in that sense is they're neglecting your system's response, the stress response that might actually yield some benefit. Is that right?
I mean, they're also ignoring the kind of milieu within which cell damage occurs, right? And the vast majority of damage to DNA within cells is from oxidative stress. It's from
okay.
oxygen, right?
Yeah. Tell me more about that. What is oxidative stress?
I mean, basically, it's you've probably heard of free radicals and all sorts of nutritional supplements that can.
I drink pomegranate juice to get rid of for the antioxidants, right? Is that what we're talking about?
Exactly. And so that stress on your body, in terms of, we talk about single and double-stranded DNA breaks, right? Single-stranded DNA breaks happen all the time. They're no big deal. We have great repair mechanisms to deal with that, especially because the other strand of that DNA sort of provides the template with which to repair the broken strand. Double-stranded is a little more complicated, and sometimes that does lead to bigger problems. But in an average day, there's something like 10,000 single-strand breaks in the DNA of a cell. So
in one cell. In one cell, you're telling me there's 10,000 breaks in DNA. That someone who doesn't know anything about this might be like, oh shit, my DNA is broken.
Well, that's the thing. Like, since the linear no threshold hypothesis, probably became sort of the standard in the 50s around the release of the Beer report, the biological effects of ionizing radiation. The first iteration of that report, the work of Hermann Muller, in terms of popularizing this idea based upon his, Nobel prize-winning research on fruit flies, where he bombarded them with absolutely enormous rates of radiation and found, mutations in further generations, right? Mm-hmm. But so there was this conception at that time, like the science has moved so much further in terms of our understanding of cellular biology. At that time, we were just learning about what DNA actually was. And the first ideas about it were that it was this sort of immutable structure, right? That was very fragile. And maybe that's based on like the guys, and the guys and the woman, Rosalind Franklin, that were actually putting together the models. And, maybe they're made out of something brittle. And if you broke it, the whole thing would fall apart like a house of cards. But in any case, our understanding of the repair mechanisms within cells has greatly changed. And in terms of the stress that the oxidative stress on your DNA versus, say, the impact of a stray gamma ray from background radiation, it's something in the order of 1,000 to 1, right? In terms of that effect, or the number of breaks you're going to have, right? So we obsess about, you're right, there is this potential damage. There's a mechanism for that. But it's a very, very, very trivial amount. And let's say that radiation had only negative effects, for humanity, then you might be able to say, like, I wouldn't really advocate, hey, Brett, you should strengthen your constitution by taking tiny bits of lead every day, or ingesting small amounts of arsenic or mercury, right? But radiation, there's so many positive benefits, in terms of, just talking about medical isotopes and diagnostic imaging. I mean, it's incredible what we take for granted. But, literally, at least tens of millions, probably hundreds of millions of medical diagnostic tests every year, cancer treatments, the list, sterilization of surgical instruments, it's absolutely enormous. The positive contributions, that's not even getting into nuclear energy and, clean air and carbon-free electricity and avoiding climate change. Like, so we have to understand relative risk. And this is just an enormous challenge that we face as people who advocate nuclear energy, because we're up against fear and gut reactions. And, you can always find a scientist that's going to back you up, right? You can always, find a fringe scientist. And that's really what the anti-nuclear movement has done. And especially if you look at the quality of the studies that are done on things like the Chernobyl accident, someone who's trained in epidemiology and in what we now call evidence-based medicine, which is kind of the new paradigm with which we assess the validity of a treatment or an investigation, right? We do these randomized controlled trials. It's based in whether we're seeing a statistically significant impact. And the old model was mechanistic, right? So it's like, yes, there's a mechanism here, it's plausible. Okay, that's medical evidence. The paradigm has shifted. So I'm hopeful that physicians that have been trained in the last 10 to 20 years are going to be able to take a much more learned approach and understand relative risk, understand correlation and causation much better, and make better decisions. And, that's kind of leading into Doctors for Nuclear Energy, but that's kind of what I'm hopeful for.
Yeah. Can you, before we get on to, the organizations that you formed and the advocacy work that you've been really pioneering, since you mentioned Chernobyl, can you walk us through like what happened, how people came into contact with radiation? And we mentioned already like the people who were cleaning it up and they got the acute radiation sickness. Those are the grays. They got the scrambling amount. Who else got affected by radiation, and how did it happen? And what do we know about that?
You got an hour? I mean, that's a huge question, obviously, right? And I don't have the exact numbers at my fingertips, right? But as I was mentioning before, something around 128 people got acute radiation syndrome, and that was people that were working in the plant at the time, kind of first responders to the accident. This was a graphite moderated reactor, which had a super criticality, and the graphite caught on fire. There was an explosion that spewed the stuff all over the place. There are people picking up bits of graphite and uranium and tossing them back into the kind of crater where the reactor had been, up on the roof, spraying water on it. So these were the folks that got really significant doses of radiation and who got acute radiation syndrome. Geraldine Thomas, who I think you guys have interviewed on this podcast, would be able to give you a much more sort of learned approach. But some of the things that I've taken away from what she's described, I mean, she's again the director of the Chernobyl Tissue Bank. She's a specialist in thyroid cancer. And in terms of the impacts beyond those workers that got acute radiation syndrome, it's not just obviously that their bone marrow was suppressed or that they lived or died. I mean, the ones who lived also had severe thermal burns, but also radiation burns. I don't want to minimize the fact that, hey, of those, I think it was around 130 people who got acute radiation syndrome, only 28 died. I mean, that's amazing, but we have to be real that the other 100 have had other major health effects. Interestingly, they haven't all died of cancer. In fact, there's not really a strong relationship in terms of what those from that cohort have actually died of. Often it's car accidents, cirrhosis of the liver, other non-radiation affected causes of death.
Right, but I think the average person, maybe average person who knows something about nuclear and history,
Sure.
Thinks that the more harmful result from Chernobyl or any nuclear accident would be something related to cancer. Can you explain to me what's happening there? What do people think? Why do they think that? And what's the reality?
Yeah, I mean, it's based on linear no threshold calculations, right? So like we were saying before, that 100-foot jump versus a 1-foot jump or a 1 centimeter jump or 1 millimeter jump, if you apply that logic to the world population, and you use linear no threshold, you can generate, it's a random number generator, right?
Yeah.
Just change the denominator, and you can claim that there's going to be this excess number of cancers, and then you can say, well, of those cancers, these many people will die from them. But it's just absolutely ridiculous because, I always ask people this question, especially if you're in the States, would you, if you got a great job in Denver, Colorado, would you move there? I mean, I would. I mean, other than I'm Canadian and, country's a bit of a dumpster fire right now, but I love skiing. I love the outdoors. I love the American Southwest. I'd move there in a heartbeat if I can have my Canadian healthcare and and whatever else, right? But I'd be getting 10 millisieverts of radiation a year, right? From just background.
And so what you're saying is that what people apply to, when some people calculated the total amount of hazard that was caused from a nuclear accident, what they did was they applied little bits of radiation over a large population to calculate a large number of deaths. But what you're saying right now is that if you apply that same methodology to Colorado, where there is a significant increase in radiation over, let's say, New York, then we would also calculate a huge number of deaths. But do we see that in reality?
No, absolutely not. Absolutely not. And then, there's these questions of, this idea of artificial radiation is different than natural radiation. We've decisively answered that. It is not, right? And then people are like, well, what about like a hot particle or an internal emitter? As if that's only, coming from an unnatural source. I mean, we breathe in uranium atoms all the time. I mean, these are the smallest, like the smallest units in our universe. And we use sieverts, right? Which applies, multiplication factors for, say, an ingested alpha emitter gets 20 times factor added to it, right, compared to an external source. So that's all factored into millisieverts. That's why it's a kind of a useful measure. Grays is absorbed dose, and millisieverts is absorbed dose with like tissue weighting factors, with the type of radiation, whether it's alpha or beta or gamma. So it's a lot to demystify. And I kind of understand why a lot of my colleagues are just like, linear no threshold, let's just take it, because it takes a lot of work to educate yourself further. And kind of circling back a little bit, like, talking about pulling the trigger on doing a diagnostic imaging test. I mean, there is that anxiety in the back of your head if your training says, hey, like, you do enough of these over your career, that little kid in front of you, that maybe that's the one in your career that you're going to give a brain tumor to, right? And the idea of inflicting that as a physician it's very scary.
Yeah.
So it's again, having that compassion and understanding where people are coming from, rather than just, sometimes being like, writing them off as just an uneducated idiot who hasn't taken the time to sort of do the research. It's very understandable why people arrive at the conclusions that they do.
It's kind of understandable, but on the other hand, I hope that doctors, which have to learn a lot of things, like doctors in my experience are very smart and have to master like many different subject matters and are constantly making risk trade-offs, would do what doesn't seem to me to be that much research to come to their own conclusion about the risks of low dose radiation compared to the benefits that they see every single day. I mean, have you ever come up with a statistic on how many lives have definitively been saved with the use of medical radiation versus how many people have ever died from radiation in the world?
I think that stat is out there, and actually just like in the few minutes before this interview, I was actually looking for it. I mean, James Hansen did some work looking at lives saved from nuclear displacing fossil, and that's about 1.8 million lives. But from radiation, I mean, I think that would be far exceeded from the effects of medical radiation. Absolutely. And getting back to your question about, yes, physicians, we need to learn a lot of things. We are trusted by our communities to be experts. Do I expect all of my colleagues to have deep dived this topic as much as I have? No, but I'll tell you who I do expect amongst my colleagues to have deep dived this. The anti-nuclear physicians. If you're going to stake an opinion on, what you perceive as the risks of radiation are, and you have not done a solid amount of research on that, like, shame on you, right? Yeah. And we know from high quality evidence, because again, you can compare the quality of studies like the UNSCAR report on Chernobyl or the Chernobyl Forum report. Again, multi-agency, multi-country, hundreds of experts, consensus decision-making, versus Greenpeace and Green Party funded research like the Torch report, the other report on Chernobyl, or the Yablokov. I don't even know whether to call it a report. It's just a bunch of abstracts from conferences and news articles that he kind of pinned together into something. From that quality of evidence, you can draw some pretty major conclusions that the major harms from Chernobyl and Fukushima were the psychological impacts of panicked evacuations and of unnecessarily large and unnecessarily prolonged evacuations. And there are physicians like Helen Caldicott who have said, extraordinary things like, more people will die from Chernobyl than from the Black Death. Like, let me remind you, the Black Death was 100 million dead, right? Like, you're trivializing a plague and you're terrifying people. And I mean, you could see her in the aftermath of the Fukushima accident, just chortling and, just loving her moment in the spotlight to terrify people. And that cost lives.
Yeah. Okay. So tell me, because you've been, and to maybe further set the stage for people, like, so you've got this podcast, you've also, got these doctors from Nuclear Group, like, you have really gone deep into studying this and meeting with experts and forming advocacy groups. Have you developed an opinion or a theory as to where the anti-nuclear sentiment itself comes from?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think it's quite clear. I just had Spencer Wirt on my show a couple of weeks ago. And I mean, this is the man he's a physicist, PhD physicist and astrophysicist who's became a historian of science and has just, absolutely deep dived this with a real mastery of the psychological literature. And he must have watched like every shitty movie from the 50s onwards that had anything to do with radiation. But you can trace this quite conclusively. And I mean, I would say, to sum it up, especially in terms of physician anti-nuclear advocacy, this really has to do with the horror of nuclear weapons, and the fear, especially as the hydrogen bomb came about, as the U.S. lost its monopoly on nuclear weapons, as everyone became vulnerable with Sputnik, and then ballistic missiles, intercontinental ballistic missiles. The fear, and I mean, I'm not sure your exact age, but I mean, my generation, I was kind of, what was I? I was 7 or 8 years old when the Berlin Wall fell. I don't really have any conscious memory or trauma in the way that my father did, doing kind of duck and cover, hiding under his table in the classroom as the Cuban Missile Crisis played out, right? But so an opportunity to try and eradicate nuclear weapons from the world. That's obviously, in terms of, if you understand anything about geopolitics, the cat's out of the bag. The technology exists. Activists are not going to convince these large nations, as idealistic as we'd like to be. And I'm a real idealist, and I engage in what I call aspirational politics, but it's not going to happen. So the concern became, well, we're building bigger and bigger bombs, we're testing all the time, and we're doing these atmospheric tests, right? And one of these tests, the Castle Bravo test, ended up, having a yield much higher than was expected. And, they evacuated an area to do this test, but the yield was larger. And this Japanese fishing vessel, the unfortunately named Lucky Dragon, the members on board that ship got acute radiation sickness, which you're describing earlier, went back to Japan. One of them died. And so this fear about fallout was really brought to the forefront. And I think Spencer Weir talks a lot about this kind of avoidance mechanism. So the sort of impact of nuclear weapons, it's just so horrific to think about, and like the blast injuries and the fire and everything else, and the power of them, the sort of civilizational ending power, is so traumatic to think about, that we sort of transfer some of our worries, and particularly kind of what's unique about these weapons is radiation, right? And certainly, we've seen fallout, on the Lucky Dragon, and if you kind of model, especially kind of ground burst nuclear weapon strikes, I mean, it's really significant what could happen with radiation. But in any case, these activists started to try and shut down atmospheric nuclear weapons testing, and the way they did that was, radiation's so special, you can't sense it until your skin starts turning red, right? Until you get kind of a sunburn from it. We don't have any sensory organs that can detect and distinguish dose in the way that we can with another hazard like fire. But with a Geiger counter, I mean, you can detect the decay of a single atom, right? And so there were studies done, like this baby tooth survey in the States, where they, got 400,000, the tooth fairy came by and got 400,000 teeth at 10-year intervals, and found, the level of, say, strontium-90, which is a isotope that's only produced artificially, had risen in the level in these children's teeth. And I mean, you think about like milk and babies, there's nothing more sacred in the world. Did that strontium-90 have any impact, in terms of a dose relationship to these children? Like, absolutely not. But, if I'm to make that advocate, if I'm to make that argument, I sound like I'm an Edward Teller, like I'm a promoter of nuclear weapons, which I'm absolutely not. But in terms of being honest about the science, global fallout from atmospheric nuclear weapons wasn't really a health issue. It was a convenient thing to latch onto to stop atmospheric weapons testing. And I applaud that. It's great that we stopped atmospheric weapons testing. But then when weapons testing went underground, the activists didn't have anything to sort of point at anymore. And so they really diverted their attention towards nuclear energy, which, became a big deal in the 70s around the time of the OPEC crisis and things like that. So.
But why are these nuclear activists so powerful in terms of their ability to stall nuclear energy development? I mean, they're activists for all sorts of stuff. Like how many times have I heard in the news that like Nike employs slave labor when putting their shoes together, or even like the stuff in your plastic water bottles. There's all sorts of news about that. I don't think they ever made a law to change that. So like, how come they were so successful in installing nuclear energy growth when they're activists all over the place that aren't successful in other industries?
I would say that the fossil fuel industry has a little something to do with that. In terms of like nuclear threatens the market share of fossil fuel industry. And I know I had Rod Adams on my show a little while ago, and, he's like, this is not conspiracy theory. This is what, executives at companies do. They identify threats. Certainly there has been direct fossil fuel funding of anti-nuclear activists. I won't say, I can't claim that that's, how widespread that is, but there's definite examples. And there's lots of indirect examples, say Bloomberg or Tom Strayer giving lots of money to Sierra Club or NRDC, which uses some of their money in anti-nuclear activities. When a nuke plant shuts down, what happens? It gets replaced by usually gas in this day and age. There's big money to be made in that. So that's certainly part of it. I mean, the kind of appeal to emotion, as I was saying, the psychological trauma of living through the Cold War makes it a very hot button potent issue. It's hard to distinguish that. Every technology in the world is dual purpose, right? I mean, the steel that makes, or the iron that makes your plowshare makes the sword as well, right? We have to wrestle with that. We're a technological species. And I think this is probably getting into this idea of the precautionary principle, but as applied to weapons, I mean, you could see, I think, especially before climate change loomed, certainly, the air pollution argument for nuclear energy is incredibly strong.
Tell me more about that. Yeah, let's double click on that for a second.
Sure. I mean, so we've gained more and more knowledge about the hazards from air pollution. And recently the WHO has even increased their estimates from, I believe, 7 million people a year dying from air pollution to about 8.5. 3 million of that is from outdoor air pollution, largely coal, also, cars, all sorts of different emissions in that regard. And 4 million is indoor from people, basically cooking over cow shit and wood, so it's an absolutely enormous burden of disease. And that's what I was pointing to in terms of James Hansen's study using which was looking at the number of lives saved by nuclear displacing things like coal.
Yeah, and this is every year you're talking about. You're talking about
every single year,
approaching 10 million lives every year lost from air pollution.
And those are lives lost. That's not just disability, right? So if you have the misfortune of growing up as a child in Delhi, your lungs are scarred. If you do pulmonary function tests on these children and monitor it over time, big, like 30-40% decrease in their lung function.
So
premature, like babies are born prematurely at astronomical rates in areas with high levels of air pollution. And again, these kind of anti-nuclear activists, it's kind of inflammatory language to say they have blood on their hands. But if you look at, Ralph Nader's role in shutting down, I believe they were developing 3 or 4 nuclear reactors in Ohio to deal with the air pollution crisis there. Ralph Nader wrote in there, used some incredible fear mongering. If there's an accident, the living will envy the dead. These nuclear plants were quietly turned into coal plants and continued to, kill. And each individual coal plant, I don't have the statistics in front of me, but it's hundreds of people per year that can die as a result of their. It depends on the scrubbers and everything that's installed, but there's a death count. And
I think one of the things that always bugs me is because some people will then say, okay, well, I still don't like nuclear. Of course, I don't like coal. So let's just replace it all with renewables. But I think that they're forgetting that per year death count, because if you can solve it 1 year faster, let's say, because nuclear is more scalable, or there's a better supply chain, for the fuel or the raw materials that go into it, or because you can do so much more with so much less. And we've seen countries go from like 0% nuclear to 80% nuclear in a decade. If you can do it faster, it's that many more lives saved. If you could do it even 1 year faster, you're talking about 8 million lives saved. You can do it 2 years faster. That's 16 million lives saved. And I think people forget it's not just about saving. It's not just about getting to a solution. It's about getting to a solution quickly as well.
Okay, but not just quickly, because that's a key argument that the anti-nuclear folks use against us, which, they're saying, well, a nuke plant it shouldn't. And I've followed your work closely, but it can take 10, 15 years to build. That's too slow. We've got this 12-year timeline. The world's going to end if we don't get it done in 12 years. Durability is a really important factor, right? So if we can build nuclear plants that, are being relicensed now or refurbished into 80, 100-year long lifespans, that's very different than, wind and solar farms, that need to be replaced every 20, maybe, to be very generous, every 30 years on an ongoing basis at a scale that's just unimaginable. I mean, the work that I believe it's Mike Conley, and I'm forgetting his co-author's name. They did, they've done the math on this and the calculations of, okay, so let's say you follow kind of Mark Z. Jacobson's climate plan, which is to be 100% in 100% renewables in the US by, I forget what date, something like 2030. Once you've installed all of that solar capacity and, paved over, states the size of, I'm forgetting what states, but very large land masses with solar panels, you get into a pattern where you're needing to replace, 2 million solar panels a day forever, once you get to scale. So durability is really, really important as well. And, and also, I mean, this is kind of going a bit further afield, but, and I've really been doing a lot of thinking about the grid as a commons, as a source of kind of social benefit to us all. When I'm trying to counter these kind of small is beautiful decentralization arguments, the grid is a lifesaver. It's really important. And, as damaging as fossil fuels have been, it's, I've developed a lot more of a nuanced take on it. Not like I would love to see fossil fuels completely replaced ASAP, with nuclear and synth fuels and other things and some hydro, whatever else. But you have to recognize that, lifespans have dramatically increased. Like industrialization, as dirty and gross as it's been, and as messy as it's been, the outcomes have been, dramatically longer lives, vaccines, potable water.
The thing is, access to energy yields prosperity across many different facets of life.
Yeah, 100%.
So, okay, so you looked into nuclear, you started these organizations, I guess you're the president of Canada for nuclear. I mean, you've really now decided that it's very clear to the lengths that you're going. This is like a lifelong mission for you now
that's pretty impressive for me, because I tend to be a little bit ADHD. I mean, medicine's been one thing I've been able to kind of sustain my focus now for, 16 years of my education and practice. But in general, I'm just a very curious person. I'm a bit of a magpie. Oh, that's shiny. That's exciting. And deep dive that and find a kind of mentor and trying to pull everything I can out of them in terms of their knowledge. But yeah, I mean, I've said this before, but, emergency medicine, it really appealed to me because of this idea of a triage ethic, right? How do you use the limited resources you have to have the biggest impact in the world? And, ultimately, you can talk about being left or right. My driver in terms of my sort of politics is I want to see everybody reach their full human potential and capacity. And so, climate change threatens that, air pollution threatens that. And I've come to the understanding that energy is this master resource, which, can really allow human flourishing to its greatest extent. And if that energy can be delivered in a way that, again, decouples it from ecological impact, then you can have these dense cities, you can have, your energy produced on a tiny, tiny footprint. You can, rewild and preserve vast tracts of wilderness, which is another, it's a humanist value. I appreciate it. I think it's good for humans to have a bunch of nature set aside to go and, restore their mental health. But, that's my take. And that's why I think I've maintained this focus, and I don't see it coming to an end. It's highly improbable. If you told my, even 30-year-old self, hey, in 6 or 7 years, you're going to be, doctoring and then basically a full-time pro-nuclear advocate, I would have laughed you off the, I forget what the expression is. I would have laughed at you, right?
That decouple word that you called out, that's because your podcast is the Decoupled podcast. So everyone should be subscribing to that as well. But I want to know, I've been listening to you. It's amazing to watch your evolution. I feel like it's something I went through as well over the course of a few years of just getting to talk to so many people.
Yeah.
But I know, at least in my situation, things have changed from where I started and just wanting to learn to then wanting to do something about it. Where is your evolution going? You're going to continue to interview people. I'm sure of that. Yeah. You're going to continue to speak at conferences and webinars and really become a thought leader of the space. I'm sure of that. Where else does it go from there? What's your win? If you could say my work will amount to this, and this will have an impact much broader than myself, where is it going?
Yeah, I got to say, the podcast is rewarding in the sense that I just get to chase my curiosity and meet incredible people polymaths, et cetera, right? The political work, I'm an activist. I want to see change in the world. It's not about really leaving a legacy, but precisely, changing the world for the better, helping people flourish. What is that going to look like? I mean, the evolution's been interesting. Like, this all started probably 3 or 4 years ago with I had a little fight with someone about climate change and whether it was, being caused or exacerbated by human activity or not. This guy was an Arctic driller, and I hadn't done any research, so I kind of knew in terms of my tribal beliefs that climate change was human caused or human exacerbated, but I didn't have the data, and so it really led me on the journey to look into it, which made me a doomer, right? You start diving into climate change, and you can get pretty depressed about it. And my ex-wife, I was just the buzzkill at the party, being like, "Hey, did you know this? Horrifying apocalyptic fact about what lies ahead in 100 years?" And she was like, "Just shut up and do something about it." And she wanted me to sort the compost a bit better, and take out the recycling, and probably buy organic food. And it led me down this rabbit hole of in terms of where my curiosity led me, and my training led me into sort of this more kind of eco-modernist framework, which then led to just reading a lot and wanting to take action. So the global stand up for nuclear events were probably what sort of launched me into actually being an activist. You can do a lot of arguing online and expend a lot of your energy trying to convince the unconvinceables. But for me, that was useful to a point. I honed my arguments. It made me really, concede a few things, but also really understand and get an evidence base for my arguments. But after a while, you want to make a difference in the world, right? So, rather than convincing the unconvinceables, you look at there's a much larger demographic here, right? And if I can reach out to them and help convince them, so that led to these stand up for nuclear events, participating in those, holding one event in Canada in 2019, and then that expanding to 3 events across the country, and then networking with there are actually a fair number of people that are quite positive about nuclear energy and very committed. And Margaret Mead said, "Never doubt that a small group of committed individuals can change the world. In fact, it's the only thing that ever has." And we're starting to do that. And so this 3 kind of 1 day a year events turned into a national organization now. And so in terms of kind of building that base of advocacy, I've been sort of casting around, and I've been talking with leading politicians across the country. I've been very fortunate. Certainly, it helps being a physician and having a compelling story. But I'm very interested in engaging with people that work in the sector, particularly nuclear energy workers. I mean, there's 60,000 of them in Canada, and they understand the merits of their sector. They understand, the benefits of what they're doing, and they understand radiation in a way that a lot of other people don't. The things that they're incredibly stigmatized, right? It's not as bad as Germany by any means, but there's a kind of cultural consensus: nuclear bad, poison, pollution, waste, etc. Right? People don't immediately think, "Oh wow, I've got clean air. Oh wow, there's medical. Oh, my surgical instruments are sterile." Oh, people don't see that behind the scenes stuff. And so, as a group of sort of citizen activists, and being able to shine positivity and appreciation to nuclear workers, I'm really hopeful that that's going to activate that base. And I mean, these are people that are directly under effect of losing their jobs and their communities being devastated, right? So that's been, beyond just the Canadian focused activism, which very much involves reaching out to workers and unions, internationally trying to create networks of solidarity between plant workers at this threatened plant in Belgium and say Diablo Canyon in the States, and how can we sort of activate those relationships and understand that an injury to one is an injury to all, and support each other. And I mean, I guess that plays into my progressive past and my political biases, but I really do think that so far that's been an untapped potential of nuclear advocacy. So that's another area where I'm focusing my efforts. So kind of long-winded way to answer your question. I mean, I really hope to shift the Overton window, to create an ecosystem of organizations and advocates on the pro-nuclear side that can at least mirror what's happening on the anti-nuclear side, to shift that Overton window, and hopefully to convince my government and governments around the world to make policy decisions that are based on sound science and engineering principles, and that follow the evidence. And God, is it ever an uphill battle? And I do think about the kinds of psychologies that lead to folks like you and I sort of engaging in this, the Sisyphus, that Greek, pushing the boulder up the hill, and why we do it, and why we get a sick pleasure out of it. I mean, I guess we're kind of like ultra endurance athletes that just love the burn. But yeah, I mean, I hope to shift the window, and I hope, locally, I hope to save my local nuclear plant. I hope to get the rest of Canada off coal. We have a lot of hydro, so our electricity is actually pretty clean across the country, but we have some kind of high emitting provinces. I'd like to get a climate plan that is sort of nuclear and hydro focused onto the national agenda. These are some of the little aspirations and ambitions I have. I think it's less ambitious than your sort of global open 100 plan, although it is funny sort of talking with friends. I'm like, Brett's kind of crazy, but if you were to sort of to give someone, if I were going to hand the reins over to one sort of technocrat to solve climate change, like, I got to say, of all the people I've talked to, Brett's plan is insane, but it actually makes the most sense. So.
Well, Chris, as we wrap up this episode, I just want to say again, like, what a pleasure it has been listening to you, learning from you, and kind of watching you grow into this space. I expect nothing less than amazing things to come from your work. So thank you.
Well, thanks, Brett. I mean, it's great being a part of this broader ecosystem, like I said, and to be a part of just our little network of podcasts, but also as you've seen as well, the relationships that you build through podcasting, the people you get to meet, it's so rewarding, and we're a lot stronger than we think we are if we can organize, if we can grease our networks and call upon each other's strengths and form organizations and change the world. So let's get on with that.
Awesome. Can't end on a better note than that.
And initiate at least a new approach to the many difficult problems that must be solved in both private and public conversation if the world is to shake off the inertia imposed by fear and is to make positive progress toward peace.